I have to say, last week I enjoyed last week so much with the breakfast and an opportunity to have communion in that way with one another. That was something pretty special. I'm hoping that we have the capacity to do that on a regular basis in some interval going forward, because that was enjoyable. It was great for me even to be able to talk to people and to have some more time just getting to know folks that are part of our church family. But now we're going to get back into Esther. Esther is a dark but very hopeful book. If you haven't been with us for the first two sermons, I'd recommend go to the website, go back and listen to it just to bring yourself up to speed. Just because you sort of need the whole story here, and it's all part of one long narrative. It is PG-13, but today it should be pretty safe in that. And it's one of those books that, God's not mentioned even once, but you see him at work all over the place. And I believe that we will today. If you remember, we're following the disturbing lives of Esther and Mordecai, two Jewish folks who are highly compromised and assimilated into their own culture. Their faith seems to be very distant. The faith of their ancestors seems that it really doesn't affect their day-to-day life in any tangible fashion. Esther, well, I guess you could, some have called it a beauty contest. Remember, she was the young gal that was brought into the king's harem to spend a night with the king. And after that night with the king, she became queen. She won the contest there. Mordecai, her cousin, has worked his way into the crosshairs of an incredibly important and incredibly evil man by the name of Haman. That's sort of where we are at this point. And Haman has concocted and started the ball rolling on his version of the final solution. In other words, he's trying to eradicate all of the Jewish people. No matter where they're at, he's trying to make sure that they all end up dead. And honestly, his boss has signed off on his plan. His boss has signed off on this is going to happen, Xerxes. Now, just so we get the scope of this, remember that this is in all of the provinces. So Jerusalem is a province at this point of Persia. So all of those Jews that had gone home during the books like Ezra and Nehemiah, started the work of rebuilding the temple, should this plan go through, they all die. All of sort of the faithful followers of God, if this goes through, they're dead. Mordecai hears about this. I almost said Mordecai 4. Esther 4, verses 1 through 4. When Mordecai learned all that had occurred, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes. He went into the middle of the city and cried loudly and bitterly. He went only as far as the king's gate, since the law prohibited anyone wearing sackcloth from entering the king's gate. There was great mourning among the Jewish people in every province where the king's command and edict reached. They fasted, wept, and lamented, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Esther's female servants and her eunuchs came and reported the news to her, and the queen was overcome with fear. She sent clothes for Mordecai to wear so that he would take off his sackcloth, but he did not accept them. Mordecai is a very well-connected person. He works in the government center. He's in the center of Persian business, so he hears the news. He hears what's going on. Matter of fact, we know that he knows it in great detail, because later on he'll say the exact amount of money that Haman's paying for all of his people to be murdered. So he goes home, and he puts on a robe made of coarse goat hair. We call it sackcloth. It hurts in a way that denies a person any comfort. Have you ever been in one of those stages where you just want a little reprieve from the pain? You're like, I just want to forget about this for a minute. The purpose of sackcloth is to make sure that doesn't happen. You're never comfortable. It forces you to remember why this is going on. It forces you to feel the pain over and over and over again. And then they would take ashes and put it on their head and on their face. Honestly, it makes you look dead. And that's the purpose. You identify. Mordecai says, I'm a dead man. Here's what's going on. It makes you look like you're dead. And he heads into town, identifying with this decision that Xerxes has made. Because should this go through, he's already dead. But he could only go so far. It says he has to stop before the king's gate, because remember, you can't get near the king. If you're sad, you can't get near the king. As a matter of fact, there were 7 of his attendants that had unlimited access to him, unless one of the gals was spending the night. Other than that, the only 7, and then Haman. That's the way that it worked. But no one would be allowed in sackcloth and ashes. No one allowed to be there with a frown on their face. The king is a very dangerous and volatile man, so they keep him secluded like this. For Mordecai to go any further would have been an immediate death sentence. But he's making quite the spectacle of himself. And the news made it to Esther. And Esther realizes pretty quick that this problem out there is going to be her problem as well. So what she does is she sends a change of clothes out there and says, hey, pull yourself together, man. Get some decent clothes on. We don't do this out in public. This is a big deal. But Mordecai wouldn't be comforted. He says, no. I'm not going to stop. What we're seeing here, let's step out of this scene for a second. Esther and Mordecai are at a crossroads. They're at one of those times in life where nothing will be the same. Things are going to change one way or the other going forward. And we've all been there, right? We've all been there. If you haven't, I promise you will. Those times where you recognize that everything going forward is somehow going to be different. Some are a result of our choices, but many of them aren't. It's that time when you're sitting in the doctor's office and he walks in and said, hey, the results are in, we need to chat. It's that time when the boss comes in and says, hey, we're downsizing, some folks have to go. It's that time when your spouse says, I'm not sure we're going to make it. It's that time where it may be that your hands are behind your back with cuffs on them. Those are crossroads. Those are times where we know that whatever going forward is going to be different than it was before this. September 11th, 2001, you knew that somehow the 12th was going to be different going forward. Those times are different. And I can think back of the crossroads times in my own life and I can see them all with great detail. I can see sitting in my truck, my red Chevy pickup truck at the side of work, and coming to that point and going, I wasn't raised like this. I know better. I have to change. I can see myself in a hotel room in Russia in the middle of the night. I'd gone over by the door because Tracy was sleeping and praying. And you ever get in one of those spots where you're praying, where you're praying, you start making deals with God? If you will, I will. If you'll pull this together, I'll be this person. Those are those crossroads, those times that you know that everything's going to be different. And those times are so very, very important. We're going to come back to that here in a bit. But right now, let's step back into this story. Because Mordecai has gone downtown and he's hoping to get to Esther for some help. He doesn't have even direct access to her, but through people, he can get to his cousin. But honestly, this is even outside of her influence. She doesn't have this capacity. She can't see the king. Make sure you get this. The queen doesn't have access to see the king unless he calls for her. She's kept at his beck and call. No one gets that sort of access. She simply wasn't going to be able to help. She says, look, I can't do this. because she's not allowed to just show up in the throne room. You just show up in the throne room, and there's a chance you're going to die. And he hadn't called for her in over a month at this point. Over a month he hadn't called for his wife. Was he upset with her? Was he not as impressed as he once was with her looks at this point? And Mordecai responds with what are the most important verses in this book. Here's the hinge. This is where everything changes. Verse 13, Mordecai told the messenger to reply to Esther, "Don't think that you will escape the fate of all the Jews because you are in the king's palace. If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will come to the Jewish people from another place, but you and your father's family will be destroyed. Who knows? Perhaps you've come to your royal position for such a time as this." Now, for such a time as this, that is that's the verse of this. That's the one you put on a coffee mug. That's the verse here. But I would say this. I don't think that's the most important verse. I think it's the one right before that where everything hinges. The one right before that where he says, "Don't think that you will escape the fate of all the Jews because you're in the king's palace. If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will come to the Jewish people from another place, but you and your father's family will be destroyed." That's it. Here's what he's saying. You're in danger if you go to the king, I get that, but you're in greater danger if you don't. This is a crossroads. Everything changes now. Here's my question, just being honest. Bible student, I read this, I go, where in the world did that come from? Where's he pull this from? And don't give me, he's this or this good Jewish guy. No. His name is Mordecai. His name is an honor to a pagan god. He would have been born with a Jewish name, and he's abandoned that for this. He lives in the citadel at Susa. So all of the Jewish folks, or most of them, they'd gone back to Jerusalem at this point. He stayed there, but not only did he stay there, he's in the government center. Where in the world does this kind of theology come from? This man is assimilated and compromised in every tangible way, and yet he pulls out a grad-level theology statement here. This isn't even undergrad stuff. This is master's level theology. This is an unequivocal statement of faith from Mordecai that God will keep the covenant he made with Abraham. He's also stating that should Esther deny this covenant, she's as good as dead already. And I think someone at some place had to have taught him. Someone at some time in his life, before he got here, before he became Mordecai the politician, someone had to have taught him something. And I say that because if you are a parent, pay attention here, or a grandparent of someone who's walked away from the faith, watch. Those seeds that you plant when they're young, they don't go away easily. Now, the Bible says that if you train a child in the way they'll go, and when they're old, they won't depart from it. Make sure we get that. That's in the book of Proverbs. I've heard people talk about that as though that is a promise. That is not a promise. I wish it were. Proverbs means it is a wise saying. A proverb is a wise saying. This is a wise saying. If you'll invest in your kids when they're older, that is still there. Someone had to have invested in Mordecai at some point. And we see that even though his life is assimilated and doesn't reflect any tangible bit of Jewishness to it, somebody put something that's still there. And I say that as hope. For those, that watch your kids make choices that you wish they didn't make, those seeds don't go away easily. Sometimes it's the crossroads in life that bring those to the surface. Sometimes it's those difficulty. And think about how quick we are to get them out of those crossroads. Sometimes we're really fast to rescue them before they fall down, when in reality, by falling down, it may be that that's where they learn how to stand up. It may be that that's where they learn to rely on their faith. But I feel like I'm going to get on a soapbox here, so I'm not. Esther hears what Mordecai has to say, and she relents. She says, okay. So she comes up with a plan. Look at verse 15. Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: go and assemble all the Jews who can be found in Susa and fast for me. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my female servants will also fast in the same way. After that, I will go to the king, even if it is against the law. If I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went and did everything Esther had commanded him. This is the only reference to really anything religious. That's it. You assume that prayer goes along with fasting just because the two are hand in glove. So it's fast for 3 days, night and day. Now, there have been seasons of my life where fasting has been more active than others. There have been times where, 2 different times I can think of, where 6 months I fasted 1 day a week, during those times. But I'm going to say this, just in all honesty, I've never gone 3 days with no water. If I'm fasting, I promise you, I'm drinking as much water as what I can. Water, orange juice, I'm downing as much as I can. So to call for 3 days of no food, no water, that's tough. You've got to be feeling it at that point. And here's Esther. This is where she shines. This is a Jewish girl who abandoned her Jewish name for a name that honored the false Persian god of sex. No longer Hadassah like her parents would have called her. She had become Esther. And honestly, living up to her name, she won the crown in Xerxes' bed. Let's just call it what it is. Now, I don't mean to besmirch her in any way. Make sure you get this. I don't mean to in any way put her down, because I think it's really dangerous to judge people outside of their historical context. But to see who she was and the choices she makes, I think just puts her in an even greater light. To see the world she lived in, and to see this choice, man, that took guts. That took commitment. Now she stands at a crossroads. The girl with 2 names has to confront her true identity. And Esther, the queen, seems to step aside, and we're introduced, really, for the first time to Hadassah the Jew. For the first time we see her as she is, and she says, hey, if I die, I die. This is the way it's going to be. And after 3 days, no food and water, gaunt, thin, she puts on her robe and goes to the throne room. Now, here's the deal. Make sure you get this. If she goes in and the king doesn't, here's the way the law works. If he doesn't extend his scepter, she dies on the spot. That's what's at stake here. If he doesn't welcome her, this all goes south very, very fast. Esther 5, verse 1. On the 3rd day, Esther dressed in her royal clothing and stood in the inner courtyard of the palace facing it. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the royal courtroom facing its entrance. As soon as the king saw Esther standing in the courtyard, she gained favor with him. The king extended the gold scepter in his hand towards Esther. She approached and touched the tip of the scepter. What is it, Queen Esther? He asked. Whatever you want, even to half the kingdom, will be given to you. Oh, if it pleases the king, Esther replied. May the king and Haman, remember, Haman's the one who wants to kill everyone. Haman's the one who wanted to kill her family. May the king and Haman come today to the banquet I've prepared for them. The king said, hurry and get Haman, so we can do as Esther's requested. So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. While drinking the wine, the king asked Esther, whatever you ask will be given to you. whatever you want, even to half of the kingdom. The whole reason to say half the kingdom, any more than that, and really she becomes queen, or she becomes his boss. So he says, up to the point of me giving you the throne, whatever you want, girl, you've got it. At the sight of his beautiful wife, after 3 days with no water or food, you see his heart kind of melts. What is it? He hadn't spoken to her in over a month at this point. But somehow, and I think God probably had something to do with this, his heart melts. And she says, why don't you and Haman, the enemy, come to a dinner? Can you imagine for a second what that dinner had to be like? Y'all ever get tension at family functions? Here is sitting at her table someone who wants to eradicate her family. I remember reading 4-star Marine General James Mattis, his book. He talked about when they went into Iraq, and he was at a meeting with the leaders of some bad guys. And the way this meeting had set up is they had the whole 1st Marine Division outside of town. Only he and a couple of young guys were able to go in. And he tells the young guys before we go in, if this goes bad, just start mowing people down. I'm taking the main guy out. And at this meal, it gets tense enough to where he reaches down and takes his rifle and takes the safety off, moves it to fully automatic. Can you imagine what that room had to be like? Here's Esther sitting across the table with the man that wants to kill her whole family, and she's made a meal. And as wrong as it is, I'm going to stop right there. Because you need to come back next Sunday. So this is the crossroads of the book, and the crossroads of Esther and Mordecai's lives. And so as we're talking about this, the reality is each of us, right, we come to multiple crossroads in lives. 3 considerations when you stand at the crossroads. 3 things to think about. The first one is this: the silence of God doesn't mean he's absent or angry. It just doesn't. We've all been there, right? Those hard times, and you go, why can't I get a word from God? Where is he at in this? Because honestly, in this, who's the only one that's seemingly nowhere to be found? It's God. Where was God when Haman convinced Xerxes to kill all the Jews? Where was God when that diagnosis came in? God, where are you at? Where was God when the jets flew into the Twin Towers? Where are you at? Where was God when he did that? You fill in the blank. If we step into this story, God appears to be absent. He's not even mentioned one time. And let's make this a little more difficult, because in their world, military effectiveness kind of said your God was the one in charge. Your God was more powerful. So who's the one in charge right now? The Persians. Who's the one who was defeated? The Jews. Oh my goodness. See, from their standpoint, Yahweh was just someone else that they had taken out. Someone else that was under their thumb. We don't read of any faithfulness of folks there in Susa. God appears to have entirely left town in this story so far. Think about this. I'm going to keep making this more complicated. Think about this if you're a faithful Jew who's gone back to Jerusalem. And you're trying to pick up the pieces. They're trying to get the sacrificial system back in place. They're trying to rebuild the temple. You're trying everything you can to do what's right, and you hear about this, and you say, oh, it's Esther's plan? The one who walked out on us? You mean Hadassah, right? Oh, yeah, the one that goes by Esther. Our hope is in the Kim Kardashian of the Old Testament? Forgive me, but that's who she is, right? If you're a faithful Jew back there and you go, this is our plan? Honestly, it's got to be a kick in the gut. It just has to be. It has to be. But that's just it, isn't it? We know how this story ends. The beauty of Esther's story is that God is never gone. God is there. He's at work even when you don't see him. He's never gone. He's never not interested. He never leaves his people. His silence doesn't equate either his absence or anger. Just because you don't see him doesn't mean he's not putting things together. You see, Esther, the book as a whole, is an invitation to hope. It's an invitation to hang in there, because whatever you're facing today, God hasn't forgotten you. He said, I'll never leave you. I'll never forsake you. If you know Jesus as Lord, the battle is already won. If you know Jesus as Lord, all of your sin is already gone. When he looks at you, he sees the perfection of his Son. You don't have to try to convince him. You don't have to try to win his favor. It's already done. The barrier between you and God has been removed by the cross. But that doesn't mean that he's always going to let you in on his plan. So we hope. But it's not just that. There's value. Here's the second one. There's value in vulnerability. Sometimes, and those of you know me, sometimes I get pretty cynical. And when I'm cynical, it causes me to pull back and to protect, to build calluses. Vulnerability is the opposite of cynicism. Cynicism, easy for me to say, says it's not going to work out anyways. Why try? Kevin, would you come read this? Seriously. Cynicism consigns itself to defeat. And honestly, we live in a very cynical time. And not without good reason. The world is gifted at hurting. But that can't be the way of the church. Right? We do, though, don't we? We build calluses in our lives that keep us protected from others, to keep us protected from further injury, whatever went bad. Sadly, when we do that, we also shield ourselves from help and mercy and joy. Pain avoidance is also often joy avoidance. You have to let people into your life. And here in our story, vulnerability starts when Mordecai puts on the sackcloth and ashes and goes downtown. Cynicism would have kept him at home. Cynicism, I swear I can't say that word. You know what I'm talking about, would have caused him to run or to fight. Vulnerability led Esther to fast and then to walk to the throne room. If I die, I die. Vulnerability is the vehicle that aligned Esther and Mordecai's life to God's work. Make sure we get that. And I said, what's vulnerability look like in our lives? Choosing to open your life to the church again? Choosing to forgive again? I can stand up here and admit a weakness. Hey, I struggle with this. Here, preachers do that all the time. Or I could go on Facebook and admit a weakness, but honestly, that's not vulnerability, is it? That's just me sharing information. Vulnerability is when you and I sit down over a cup of coffee and I say, hey man, I'm struggling here. And I sit there and I'll listen when you say, what's that say about your heart? Let's talk about that. That is vulnerability. And vulnerability is never more important than when you're standing at the crossroads. That's the time where it counts. Third one, choose to trust God's ways. Mordecai called on God's covenant, maybe for the first time in his life. Esther called for prayer, maybe for the first time in her life. Choose God's ways even when they're hard. Probably most importantly, when they're hard. Choose forgiveness. Choose to stand up for the weak. Choose grace over judgment. Choose to stand up against hypocrisy. Choose the way of holiness when other ways would be easy. You may not be at a crossroads today, but I will tell you this, the very best way to prepare for a crossroads is the 10,000 little choices you make along the way. I can promise you this, David didn't just show up and kill Goliath. David had made 10,000 choices along the way to trust God when it was hard, to choose to be vulnerable, to choose his ways all along the way so that when those big crossroads came, the right choice was already there. Choose to trust that God is with you. Recognize, and I've got to imagine, because I'm often in this position, so I've got to imagine I'm not the only one. God hadn't left, and he hadn't left you. That's important. I want to theologically explode when I recognize sometimes when people say, well, this went bad, surely God's not in it. And I go, if something didn't work, I didn't mean God wasn't in it. And it doesn't mean he's left, okay? God is with you if you know Jesus is Lord. The second one is this: make sure you choose vulnerability. Choose to love. Choose the way of the cross over and over. Choose his ways. And they'll help us when we get to those crossroad moments like Esther and Mordecai are. Father, we thank you for your love. We thank you that you stay when we would have left. God, as we read this old story, would you remind us of just how awesome you are? And give us the guts to be vulnerable. Fill us with your Spirit so that we have the strength to choose your ways. And help us to remember that we can always trust you even when we can't see what you're doing. In Jesus' name, amen.